the existing things are divided into that which is eternal and that which is created. And that which is eternal, right? The eternal is his essence and his and attributes. So the eternal being, which is Allah, he is his essence and his attributes. And the being that knows of other things outside of himself, he is also all knowing of his essence and attributes. Therefore, it is necessary that he be all knowing of his essence and attributes if it is proven that he is all knowing of other things. So, what we're saying is, if Allah knows of things outside of himself, then for sure he must know of his own essence. He must have an awareness of his own essence and attributes. How do you know that he has knowledge of things other than himself? Because quite obviously, anything other than himself is his own creation and his well-ordered action. So how could he not be aware of his own creation and his actions? This indicates his ability to do what was mentioned above. In other words, he is aware of himself. If someone sees organized lines, for example, emanating from a writer, and then doubts that he is knowing of the craft of writing. So if someone sees a writer and then he says, I don't think this person knows how to write, the person who has this doubt is indeed foolish, because it's been proven that he is knowing of himself and other things. So in other words, if a person knows that they can write, they know they can write because of the effect of their writing. So Allah knows he is knowledgeable. He is knowledgeable of himself. He has knowledge of his own attributes because he expresses those attributes. If he did not express those attributes, then he would not know he had those attributes. Similarly, we gave the example of a person writing. A person knows how to write because he carries the attribute of writing. So if he is writing and we can see the effects of his writing, like on a piece of paper, a straight line of writing, then this indicates that he knows that he can write. He has a capacity for writing. If someone doubts that he knows that he can write, then this is foolish. So similarly, because Allah has this perfect order and craftsmanship in his creationship, this proves that Allah has knowledge, well, especially knowledge of himself, that he is capable of doing these things. Otherwise, this would be foolish to doubt. The same way when we see someone writing and we doubt he knows that he can write, because he is expressing this attribute, or else he would not be able to do anything at all. So there might be a question: is his knowledge, does it have an end? And we say, although created things may be finite at the current moment, the possibilities of what could exist are infinite and unending. So that's why فإن الموجودات في الحال وإن كانت متناهية فالممكنات في الاستقبال غير متناهية. So it says, so basically, in the future, or any possibilities for the future are without end. So therefore, Allah's knowledge is also limitless, infinite. And there's an example here. Also, if we continue doubling numbers, then the numbers would carry on. You could keep on doing this exercise infinitely. Your life will be completed before you can reach the end of doubling numbers. So this shows that humans only grasp a small part. Similarly, God knows all possible variations as well. And so he doesn't only just know the possible futures, he knows all possible variations of what could have been as well. And he has the endless details beyond human comprehension. So Allah has knowledge of particulars as well, according to us. One thing that I did notice before, when I was in the discussion of power and explaining the occasionalism of Christian Western theology from Maliblanche, and then there was the occasionalism which is attributed to the Ash'ira, we actually believe that Allah does everything. So it isn't like a general power, general power. Allah is, everything is a direct act of Allah. That's a difference here, because we believe he relates to all particulars and not just in a general sense. Anyways, with regards to Allah having knowledge of all possibilities, this shows Allah's knowledge is unlimited and encompasses everything, both the actual and the possible. And then, so we could say that this is a type of teleological argument once again, because Imam Ghazali is appealing towards the orderly fashion of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, and it shows that Allah must have knowledge, or else there wouldn't be any order, because how would a person know, or how would Allah know what to do how would Allah know even what it means to be orderly if he didn't have knowledge? So he must have some kind of knowledge, even if he arbitrarily determined that when certain things interact in a certain way, they will cause a certain effect and you will have a certain kind of order and sequence towards it. Even if that was arbitrary on his part, the concept of order itself must have been known, or else there would be no the order at all. So also, since Allah has knowledge of all causes and effects, then He must have knowledge of Himself, who is the ultimate cause. So that's an interesting line of thought as well, because Allah has knowledge of everything that He creates, and part of His creation are these causes and effects, and Allah is in fact the ultimate cause, so He must have knowledge of Himself. Then we have this third attribute, which is haya, life. So we claim that He, Allah the Most High, is alive, and this is known by necessity. So ندعي أنه تعالى حي وهو معلوم بالضرورة ولم ينكره أحد ممن اعترف بكونه تعالى عالم قادرا. Anyone who accepts that Allah is knowledgeable, knowing, and He has power would not deny that Allah has life. Also, for someone who is all-knowing and all-powerful, being alive is necessary, because what we mean by being alive is only that which is aware of itself and knows itself and others. So it's a type of consciousness. So to be alive, Imam Ghazali is saying, is a type of awareness, a consciousness of oneself and of others. So the all-knowing. So if Allah is all-knowing, then of course He must be alive, because He has awareness of Himself and others. He gathers information, is capable of all ability. So how can He not be alive? This is clear, and consider it. So out of all other attributes, هذا واضح والنظر في صفة الحياة لا يطول. So it doesn't really, like, theoretical speculation isn't really required excessively when contemplating the attribute of life with Allah. It's something which is so obvious, because we are defining life here as something of an awareness. ما يشعر بنفسه ويعلم ذاته غيره. That He knows, He has awareness, something which has awareness. And that's also sentience. Something which has awareness is something which has life. And of course, if someone is knowledgeable and has power and is aware of this, then they of course are alive. And then he discusses al-irada, as-sifatul rabi'a, al-irada, and there's quite a lot of discussion here. So we're claiming that Allah is a volitional agent and free agent and willful agent. He willfully acts. His actions are intentional, and the proof of this is that the actions which come forth from Allah, they are a specific type of possibility, and which require a sufficient reason to be selected. So there are many different possibilities which could have occurred, but once a specific possibility occurs instead, and this requires a sufficient reason, an explanation as to why one specific path was chosen as opposed to another. And Allah's essence by itself isn't enough to explain this preference. So there must be a reason for preferring one possibility over another. This is because the essence by itself is impartial, really, to two different things, two opposites. So there needs to be something which specified one state over another. And similarly, the qudra is not sufficient is not a sufficient explanation as to why one possibility was chosen over other, because because the power, as we mentioned before, Allah's qudra in relation to all possibilities is the same. So over two opposing things which could have occurred, the power has control over both of those. It encompasses both of those possibilities, and any one of them could have occurred. So the power by itself isn't a sufficient explanation as to why one preference was chosen. Knowledge isn't sufficient to explain why one possibility was chosen over another. So Ka'bi disagrees. He believes there's an individual who believes that not the knowledge could explain why one possibility was chosen over another. This is because knowledge, he believes, is more sufficient than the will, because knowledge follows that which is known, and it is related to that. So because knowledge doesn't change and it's fixed, therefore this Ka'bi preferred to say that knowledge suffices to explain the preference, because it's already fixed. It's known, it doesn't change. So whatever was predetermined in the knowledge, that is what will happen. That's what some people say. However, Imam Ghazali is saying that knowledge refers to all possibilities, and also knowledge. The knowledge of Allah is also related to those things which are not possible as well. So going back a bit. So with the knowledge, because it's related to all possibilities and all impossibilities, everything is included in the knowledge. It's infinite, like we just explained before about when we explained the attribute of Allah, which is knowledge. It's infinite and it's never ending, includes everything and every detail. So the knowledge by itself does not give it is not a sufficient reason for explaining why one possibility was preferred over another. So every alternative possibility is equipossible. There's no intrinsic reason to favor one over the other. So rejection of determinism via essence. So we said this: Allah's essence cannot determine one possibility over another. It relates symmetrically to all outcomes, and so there's a problem of indifference. The philosophers, like Neoplatonists, who claim the world proceeds from Allah's essence alone, fall into this necessitarianism, and they deny divine freedom and temporal creation. Right. So, but then we are saying that Allah, He creates His a volitional agent. So we say that the power enables the actualization of possibilities. Remember, we said that Allah, we defined power qudra as that which prepares the agent for action, and it is that by which actions occur. So the actions of Allah occur because of the power. So if the power was Allah just had power, then all possibilities would have come into existence. So it would have been like a modal realism of sorts. But this does not happen. Power enables the actualization of possibilities, but does not determine which is actualized. So power is non-directional in relation to alternatives. Power by itself doesn't have a preference over what possibility should be realized. So rejection as well. But so Ka'bi, he said that knowledge by itself was sufficient, but knowledge is descriptive and it is not causal. It apprehends things as they are, but it does not bring them into being. So what we're saying, the modern analogy might be an epistemic axis is not the same as ontological grounding. So just because you have knowledge of something, it isn't the same as it isn't the same, or it doesn't suffice for the existence of something in a certain way. So instead, rather, attribute is required for Allah to determine what possibility will arise, and this is why we say that the will is necessary. So only the will explains the modal determination, why this particular world, time, or state rather than another. So the will provides us with a sufficient condition for selecting between equal possibilities. This is beautiful, because the will itself is an attribute that Allah discusses many times in the Quran. وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا أَن يَشَاءَ Allah. It's clearly mentioned that Allah has a will, and also He says يَفْعَلُ مَا يَشَاءُ. Allah does whatever He wills, He intends. And then there's also the verse in Surah Kahf which says not to say that you will do anything tomorrow except illa yasha Allah, except through the will of Allah. So this is a clearly established attribute in the Quran. So there's a potential objection that Imam Ghazali is anticipating. So if God's will is equally related to all options, what makes it select one? Doesn't this require another will? And so on. So this is a possible objection which might lead to an infinite regress, because we're saying now that there is a will which determines what possibility occurs. So someone might say, what caused that will to choose that specific possibility? Was there not something else outside of this will that persuaded the will, or convinced the will, or caused the will to lean towards a specific possibility instead of another? And we say, Imam Ghazali says, this is not even a true problem. The will itself is eternal. So the way that this objection goes is, was the will, what was this thing which caused the will to choose a possibility? Did it always exist, or did it come into existence? If it always existed, then it must have chosen that from eternity, and then the universe must have been eternal. It's these philosophers making these arguments. And if it wasn't eternal, then that thing which caused the will to make that choice, what about that? Was that eternal, or was it not eternal? And what made that thing make the will make that specific choice, and so on and so forth. So it becomes like an infinite regress. But this is a pseudo problem, because the will is eternal. It doesn't need any further cause. Some people will carry on putting forward additional attributes to say, yes, the will chose this specific possibility or outcome because of this additional reason or cause, but then there are problems there, such as the infinite regress. So what we say, no, the will itself is where where this regress comes to a stop. This is where it ends at, this will. in terms of the outcomes and possibilities that to be chosen. So there is no need of a further cause. So this question misunderstands the nature of divine will as a timeless and not a temporal event needing a trigger. So it attempts to trace a reason for the will specification and misunderstands that it's a non-composite and a non-temporal um, attribute of Allah. And also, I should just note here that the will is something which, by definition, means to making a choice, choosing something. So, by definition, the will itself is that, by virtue of which something is chosen. So, why would that? Why would you need to posit anything further outside of that? The will itself is what chooses which possibility. Though, and we have no problem with saying it's arbitrary. So then there's another critique. The philosophers who are we refer to those who believe that God is a necessitarian God. These are some of the Islamic Neoplatonists, some of the Shia. So they claim the world emanates necessarily from Allah's essence, like how the light necessarily comes from the sun. Imam Ghazali rebutes this. He says that Allah's agency, by saying that Allah necessarily creates the universe, this denies Allah's agency and implies the eternity of the world, right? And so obviously, and one of the main reasons for Imam Ghazali's rejection of this was because of it seems to go against clear verses in the Quran, which imply that Allah has a will, as I've mentioned earlier. And because Allah created the universe, the creation, it shows that the universe did not always exist. Also, this view cannot explain specificity ta'yin of takhsis. Why was this cosmos and why was this arrangement? Why this specific temporal order and arrangement? Because if it was necessary, then what makes this a certain arrangement of the universe necessarily emanate from the one? Why is it not a different one? But if Allah has a will, then the arbitrariness of this specific universe is explained by the arbitrary nature of a will, which is a free choice. A will is basically a complete free choice. Like we have two glasses of water in front of us, they're both the same in all respects, and we, by free choice, choose to drink one over the other, which is a choice. It's arbitrary. That's the point. This universe has certain constraints which appear arbitrary when considered from an external or an objective lens, and that's why we explain this via the will. So the examples that Imam Ghazali gives, like the opposite directions of celestial motions are all equally possible. So why is it that you could in modern parlance you could say, why is it that the Earth must rotate in a specific direction and why not the other? And we say the fixed celestial poles. So you can see this is based on medieval astronomy, which they held seriously. So which also shows that you can take into consideration science and physics and astronomy and cosmology today to help refine your points in terms of your theological points. So if there are fixed celestial poles among infinite poles, so it demands a specifier, and this shows evolution. So you could see that the Earth has certain poles, and the Earth is a sphere, and there's an infinite amount of points where these poles could have been. However, they were chosen at a specific pole, like the North Pole and the South Pole, and because it's specific, this implies evolution. So that was the philosophers addressing them. Then the Mu'tazilah, they say that they are causal libertarians. They say that Allah doesn't create the action. So the claim is Allah's will is created. They believe that Allah's will is created, and it is not an attribute that exists within His essence. This is the reason they say that the will is created, is because they believe every action is the effect of another will. So they're saying there's a new will for every action or every instance. So Imam Ghazali's rebuttal of this is that if the will is not in Allah, then calling Him a willer is semantically empty. Meaning, this implies that what we're trying to say here is, if you say that Allah is the one that wills, even though He doesn't have the attribute of willing, then it's just superficial to call Him someone that wills. So a will detached from the subject is incoherent. Agency must be grounded in the agent. So it's not meaningful to call Allah a willing agent if the will does not exist within Him. Then you have the Karramiyya. or the anthropomorphists. So these are like modern day Salafis and Taymis as well. They'll have these similar positions. They'll say Allah's will is a temporal accident in His essence. They say Allah has will. However, this will is hadith, has many wills, and these are new events. So God is a locus of change. Allah changes. Imam Ghazali refutes this. He says this introduces change into Allah's eternal nature and it implies contingency, which is theologically unacceptable. And we've already expressed how Allah is pre-eternal and post-eternal. We said that because He is post-eternal as well, he cannot change. This would imply that something, because when we say He doesn't change, it means a new event occurred within Allah's essence. So you have to ask, why did that previous event, which must have been eternal, what caused it to change? Is it possible for anything to change change an eternal thing? Then you have to give us a feasible reason how, because it can't be the case that that previous eternal thing Allah acted upon it to make it non-existent, because non-existent itself isn't a thing at all. Let's say A exists and the opposite of A existing is A not existing. So if A not existing was an eternal state of non-existence, then it isn't within the power of Allah, as we previously explained, because the power of Allah is related to bringing things about, and this isn't something which is about, rather it's the lack of existence. So Allah doesn't do non-existence. So that's one of the reasons. And then we also said that was there a condition because of which Allah's previous state changed and a new event occurred, then this means that this condition was no longer in existence. So you have to ask how, if this condition was eternal, then how is it that this eternal condition was lost? Then the question arises that this condition, it must have been either eternal itself or it was a new event. If it was a new event, then how could a new event be a condition for something that was eternal? If it was an eternal condition, then how can it be that something eternal which disappeared? And if it was an eternal condition that faded away eternally, then that new event would have always existed. Anyways, that was just a throwback back towards the discussion of Allah being eternal, which we could see in one of the previous sessions. Then Imam Ghazali, he explains the position of Ahl Sunnah, which you could call divine simultaneism. Allah has an eternal will, and that eternally determines specific events. So you could talk about it in grounding terms, that the T occurred in virtue of Allah's will determining that it would exist at a specific time. So no new will arises, no change in God occurs. The actualization of the contingent effects happen in time, but the will itself is timeless. So this avoids an infinite regress by rejecting the need for a cause for the will. Then there's some modern parallels on philosophical concepts. Modal realism. God, we don't hold to this modal realism. In a sense, you could say that we do, in that all these possible worlds exist in the knowledge of Allah, including even possible concepts also exist, but only one is selected. So the real, insofar as Allah knows of them. And then we also believe in libertarian free will for Allah, that Allah's will introduces this genuine choice between all these possibilities. Then you have the PSR, the will provides the necessary grounding for contingency. So here again, just a bit fleshing out a bit more some of the other views, like the Mu'tazila. They said that they make a claim that every action occurs through a newly originated will, and the problem with them is they're not considering the definition of will. What they're using will is just to explain an action that occurs, a new event that occurs. It needs a will, and this will itself is created. But like I said, this leads to an infinite regress, because why did the will itself occur at a specific time? What caused that will to happen at that time? And then you'd have to ask what caused that other thing which caused the will to occur then, and then what caused that thing to occur then, and you'll have to keep asking the question. So they don't have a good framework for defining the will. That's because they fell for the trap of trying to explain too much, because they didn't want to seem arbitrary, Allah to seem arbitrary in what He does. But however, it will have to be arbitrary, or it would lead to an infinite regress, which is absurd. So they cannot explain why this will occurred and not its opposite. And then also the Karamiya, they avoid the problem of the will existing outside Allah, but they still don't solve the core problem of what determines a particular act over its opposite. Because even if you move the place of the will from outside Allah and inside Allah, you still have the problem of you don't have a grounded definition of what the will is. And because of that, you have to say that there's an explanation for each will, the occurrence of each will, and that would lead to an infinite regress. And then we say the will is eternal, not created. It's a distinct attribute of Allah. It's not reducible to His power or knowledge. It determines which of the possibilities, equally possible outcomes occur and when. So someone might say, and then there was objection: why did the will choose one over its equal? And then that was a problem that everyone else would have, and they responded by saying, oh, it's because of such and such. But then that would, like we said, if you say it's because of such and such, that such and such would also require an explanation, and it would continue until it can continue infinitely. We say that's just a category mistake. The will, by definition, is that which selects between possibilities. So asking why the will chooses is like asking why does knowledge reveal, or why is a possibility possible. These are just essential attributes. These are known by definition. They're not caused by something else. So we avoid the infinite regress. The eternal will is not caused by another will, so it halts the regress. So we avoid the infinite regress. The eternal will is not caused by another will, so it halts the regress. The will functions as a primitive sort of metaphysical principle, like necessity or possibility, that grounds differentiation. So all possibilities, mumkinat, whether good or evil, beneficial or harmful, are within the scope of Allah's power. So Allah's power relates to all possibilities equally. It does not prefer one over another. Like we've said, Allah's power, we've already explained what Allah's power cannot be the reason to explain why one possibility was chosen over another. So this is why Allah's will, irada, is required. So the divine power, you could say, is modally neutral. It's capable of bringing about any contingent effect. Power alone explains ability, but not why a specific possibility was actualized. So the divine will is a principle of specification, ta'yin. The will selects which among equally possible alternatives becomes actual. This avoids the need to say something external forced Allah's hands, or that events arise by chance. So will is a metaphysical selector. So all events are willed events. If something occurs, it was selected by the will from the field of all other possibilities. Therefore, all that happens, including evil as well, is willed. So you could say there's a sort of theodicy embedded in this view. Imam Ghazali doesn't outright say this, but I just thought about it. So if evil is amongst the possibilities that divine power encompasses, then if there were no evil ever actualized, then that would either imply that Allah's power does not extend to evil outcomes, which is a contradiction, because we said Allah's power extends to all outcomes. And if it didn't, then this would compromise Allah's omnipotency. Or secondly, it would imply that His will is somehow externally constrained to always prefer the good. So this contradicts Allah's independence and freedom. So if there was always good things that happen, then someone could possibly question that Allah is either not capable of creating bad things, or what we conceive as evil or suffering, or He is somehow limited and restricted by something external to Him, which makes Him weak and powerless. So some evils must be willed, not because Allah loves evil, but to affirm the fullness of His power and preserve the freedom of His will. So the power encompasses all possibilities. Will specifies which becomes actual. If evil is among the possibilities, and it clearly is, then some evil must be actualized through the will, not despite it. This also means God's will is not bound by moral standard external to Him. So we kind of buy in the second one of the Yuthrow's dilemma. He does not will evil, but as a component within a total, possibly good ordered whole. His commands, His amr and irada are not always aligned. So Allah has an amr. So we might say that Allah wills good and evil, but Allah's commands, His evils, and we'll discuss this in His kalam, are always good. And the Mu'tazila have an objection to this. They say they believe Allah does not will evil or sins because Allah hates them. He dislikes evil. So Imam Ghazali's response: if most of creation consists of what God hates, then most of creation is against His will. So if you're saying that Allah's will cannot be connected to that which is evil, that we see and we find, and even the Quran says that majority of people do evil, and a lot of people will go to hell because of the evil actions and the sins, then that would mean that all of this was outside Allah's will, that the majority of the events that occur in the universe are outside, especially with regards to humanity and consciousness and conscious actions. All of this will be outside Allah's will, which makes Him weak. So we say no, all of this good and evil is within His will. So this implies an inability that God cannot prevent what He hates, a denial of omnipotence. So this position is closer to affirming a limited, powerless God, which is theologically unacceptable. So some other objections, which we can discuss next time. But there are some other philosophical concepts here, like contingency, imkan, determinacy, infinite regress, essentialism, the will has an essential nature, divine simplicity. And then next there's a specific arguments against the Karamiya view. We'll discuss that next time.